welcome to Likeable Science. I'm your host, Ethan Allen. Glad you've joined us for another episode of Likeable Science today, where we try to make science accessible and appealing to people of all backgrounds. We try to show people how science is a vital, dynamic, and interesting part of everyone's life. Today, to help me in this exploration, I have Alex Wegman, Dr. Alex Wegman here from Island Conservation, a program manager there. Alex took a bachelor's degree in anthropology originally, but then shifted into botany in his doctoral program at UH. Did his graduate research at Palmyra Atoll in a fascinating topic that we'll get into a little later on in the show, looking at how the rats on the atoll have affected the terrestrial ecosystems there. But we want to talk sort of a little more generally about conservation strategies and conservation on Pacific Islands. And so I thought, let's just begin by talking a little bit about what makes islands special in terms of conservation. Why are they so vulnerable?
Well, aloha, Ethan. Thank you for welcoming me to the show. That's a question that we could spend the rest of the show obviously answering, so I'll try to give a short response to it. Islands, and not Pacific Islands, and not just Pacific Islands, islands around the globe are very unique ecosystems. And the species that are indigenous to those islands are also very unique by the fact that those islands are remote and are for the most part, removed from the evolutionary processes that are happening on continental land areas. So species that originally naturally colonized remote islands may have come over with behavioral traits that allowed them to avoid predators or be resistant to diseases. But during their evolutionary process on the island, when they're cut off from those factors, they tend to lose a lot of those traits. And so they become specifically vulnerable to predators when they're introduced to that system, to new predators, or to diseases, or something like that.
Yeah, I see. And on top of that, islands, because they've been colonized, particularly remote islands, have been colonized only sort of intermittently, typically are very sort of open ecosystems, right? They're not really filled up. There aren't animals occupying each and every niche on them, so they're fairly easy for newcomers to grab some space, as it were, and then wreak havoc sort of incidentally on other species.
Yeah, exactly. The colonization process is really slow from a human time perspective. From a geological time or biological time perspective, it's pretty good, goes at a pretty good pace. But from what the time scale we're used to, yeah, new species don't naturally colonize islands within years or decades. It's millennia or longer time periods.
Right. Hawaii has only really 2 species of mammals, right, that are native to Hawaii.
Yeah, exactly.
One seal, who presumably swam here, and one, well, now I guess they're saying it's 2 species of bats, but so I guess it's questionable whether it's
probably one ancestral species that is now split.
Right. Yeah. So and that gives you some sense because Hawaii's been here a long time and it hasn't gotten any more mammals, right?
Right.
So yeah.
Right.
And so, what are some examples? I mean, clearly we see this in Hawaii. Invasive species have come on in, and native species have vanished in many cases. This has played out, I'd imagine, a lot worse in smaller islands too, right?
Right, it has. And so, I'll give an anecdote or an example of here in Hawaii. One of, I think, the best examples is not what we see, but what we don't see. So for the really charismatic seabirds like albatross, Laysan albatross, black-footed albatross, used to be throughout the main Hawaiian Islands, nesting on the beaches, probably also nesting in open mid-elevation areas. And now we only find them in just a few spots. They're on an offshore island like Lehua Island off of the northern tip of Ni'ihau. They're nesting at Kilauea Point and around that area of Kauai. And they're nesting at Kaena Point here on Oahu, but they used to be everywhere. And they are they're very typical of island species in that they don't have a good defensive response or flee response to a predator when it comes in. So if a cat or a dog that has since been brought to the islands in the last couple hundred years, or 1,000 years, encounters an albatross colony, the albatross don't know to fly away. And so they just sit there on their nests, and the cats and the dogs can just wreak havoc on them.
Yeah, yeah.
And so we've lost almost all of the albatross colonies within the main Hawaiian Islands.
Yeah.
So that's a Hawaiian Island example. I guess what was your question?
Well, no, I mean, it gets exactly back to this issue of what makes these islands so vulnerable. Yeah, the behavioral traits of the island native species contribute to that vulnerability and make make it even more problematic.
Right.
And therefore, in a sense, and what's been tried in some places is to fence the non-natives out, basically, to build fences that will keep cats, dogs, whatever you want, away. But of course, particularly on smaller islands, that's may not be feasible, right?
Right. Right.
And for things like cats are notoriously hard to fence out anyhow.
Right.
So.
Yeah. Doable, but hard.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
So let's talk then a little bit about this group that you work with, Island Conservation. Can you tell us what you guys do and sort of how you go about it in general terms?
Yeah, of course. Island Conservation is a nonprofit organization founded in 1994, I think it is, became a nonprofit in 1997. And we've grown from just the founders, which were two professors at the University of Santa Cruz, who were very interested in conservation biology and working on islands down on the Baja Peninsula of Mexico, and working on those islands to study the seabird populations. And during that research, they encountered a number of scenarios where introduced vertebrates, either rats or cats or rabbits, were having a significant detrimental impact on the seabird populations that they were there to study. And so they got funding to remove those introduced mammal populations from the islands to protect the seabirds, and they found that to be extremely effective. And so they developed the organization Island Conservation to continue that work and expand that work elsewhere. So now we have, I think we're about 35 employees. Island Conservation is global. We mostly focus on the Pacific Rim and the Caribbean, but we do consider ourselves to be a global organization. We have program offices in multiple different locations, one of which is here in Hawaii, and our headquarters is based in Santa Cruz, California.
So it's a nice, very focused thing. It's in a sense, we're trying to sort of turn back the clock and say, let's get the island rebalanced by removing the invasive species that have unbalanced the whole ecosystem in the first place.
Yeah. So what our organization has found, and we're not the only ones doing this. There's actually quite a few organizations and agencies, so really robust community throughout the world that is focusing specifically on the removal of invasive species from islands to prevent extinctions.
Actually, it's funny. I was just earlier this week at the Hawaii Environmental Education Alliance Symposium, and some of your fellow people in that line of work in different organizations, but several new of you. So here's some info about up on the screen here about island conservation, I guess.
Yeah. So there, I guess this info that's on the screen right now speaks to the global community that island conservation is part of, and there have been over 1,500 eradications of invasive species from islands, and these are all conservation actions. So they're the eradication of an invasive species to protect a native species or a native ecosystem that is considered endangered or at risk of extinction.
Sure.
And so this is a process that's been going on now for several decades, probably about 60 years. It's really been an organized conservation tool. And in the last several decades, it's really taken off as technology and the focus of the conservation community have kind of come together to really recognize this tool, that the removal of invasive species from islands, is an extremely effective way to protect threatened species.
Right. Now, in some cases, this must get to sort of be a tricky line to draw what's an invasive species, right? Because so many of the Pacific Islands, for instance, have all kinds of plants that were brought to them by their first settlers.
Right.
And palm trees, coconut palms, banana, that kind of stuff
Right.
are not native to a whole bunch of islands,
Right.
including Hawaii. And yet no one really wants to get rid of those, at least off of a lot of places where people live, right? Because these
Yeah.
are great resources. So
That's actually a fantastic question, and it's one that comes up a lot, and it's not easy to answer, but because people do define these things differently. But the way that I function and that I make sense of it is that there are introduced species, and then there are invasive species, and they're not always the same thing.
Okay.
So you can have introduced species like banana that is not invasive.
Okay.
It's not running up the watersheds and displacing native trees and native vegetation.
Okay.
And then you do have introduced invasive species like Albizia, which is a really tall introduced canopy tree species that is shading out and displacing native trees and other components of the native plant community here in Hawaii.
Okay. No, good distinction, yes. Because many of the introduced species were actually purposefully introduced and are very
Right.
valuable species
Very valuable.
commercially or to people's lifestyles or whatever.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
Excellent, excellent. So you quoted a figure there of 1,500 successful species removals and restorations. This is virtually, are these almost all from Island Conservation as an organization or?
No,
Oh,
no,
okay.
definitely not.
Okay.
Island Conservation has been involved with, I think it's 52 projects now. We have a few more on our table right now, but yeah, 52 projects.
Oh, okay.
And but so that's the 1,500 plus projects that have happened. Those have been completed by the greater community.
Excellent, excellent. But that's it's a very interesting strategy in the sense that it's sort of counterintuitive because it is very hard to turn the clock back, right?
Right.
And indeed, and we'll get into this, I think, probably in the next segment a little more. When you remove an invasive species, particularly when it's been there for a while, it has had major impacts on the ecosystem.
Yes.
And it's already changed that ecosystem, so just removing it does not necessarily restore you to a pre-invaded state, right?
Exactly. No, that's true. I mean, that would be the ideal scenario.
Right.
However, in a lot of cases, that's not possible because some of the damage that's been done is permanent. With if the invasive species that was introduced has led to the extinction of critical components of that ecosystem, those are components you're just not going to recover.
Right. Yeah. Anyhow, this is great. This is a good introduction. We're going to get more in depth into your work at Palmyra when we come back. So you're here on Likeable Science with us again. I'm your host, Ethan Allen. I'm here with Alex Wegman from Island Conservation today, and we're going to take a short break and then we'll return. See you.
Aloha, I'm Kili'i Akina, president of the Grassroot Institute and host on Ehana Kako, a weekly program on the ThinkTech Hawaii broadcast network. Ehana Kako means let's work together. Think of the sad alternative, let's not work together. Here in Hawaii, with all of our diversity and the richness of the people, it's important for us to come together around issues on the basis of what's right and what's good and what's going to serve the common good. And that's what we try to do at Ehana Kako. Every week, we interview movers and shakers, people in government, business, and other sectors of society to talk about how to create together a better government, economy, a better world here in Hawaii that can bless the rest of the world. I thank you for your attention to ThinkTech Hawaii, and we look forward to seeing you every Monday, 2 to 3 p.m. on the ThinkTech Hawaii broadcast network. We're Ehana Kako, and we wish you well. Aloha.
And you're back here on Likeable Science. I'm your host, Ethan Allen, here on ThinkTech Hawaii. With me today in the ThinkTech studios is Alex Wegman from Island Conservation, and we're talking about conservation of islands and the particular challenges and needs for that. And so I want to dig in here a little bit more specifically about your graduate work, and I had learned about this through reading Susan Scott's wonderful book, Call Me Captain. You went down to Palmyra Atoll and spent years there, I gather, studying the issues of what had happened with these rats that had been introduced there centuries earlier, so they were well established,
Right.
and trying to figure out what to do about it. So,
Yes. So, right, how do I start? I went down to Palmyra Atoll in 2004 as part of my graduate work with the University of Hawaii in the botany department to look at just what you described. How has the introduction of rats to the small tropical Pacific atoll ecosystem, have the rats changed that ecosystem, and how will that ecosystem change if the rats are removed? So rats were introduced to Palmyra and probably actually not that long ago, probably about 60, 70 years ago, around the time of World War II. The U.S. military, it's a long story, I won't go into it, but they annexed the atoll. It was privately owned at that time. They annexed it to turn it into a refueling station and a hospital base, and just completely restructured the atoll. And in that process, they had 4,000 people down there at one time, so a lot of people. And in that process, inadvertently, I'm sure, brought rats down with them. And when the military left at the end of World War II, the rats stayed. And as the atoll recovered, as the ecosystem recovered from the military presence, the rats re-engineered or had a very significant role in how that ecosystem played out, how it rebuilt itself.
Yeah. Absolutely, because rats, of course, are they're generalists, as the animals go. They can eat a huge variety of different kinds of foods, different types of foods. They're very resilient, they're very prolific, and in a place like Palmyra, they can breed year-round. And there are about 25 different islands, I think you said, in Palmyra?
Yeah, so Palmyra Atoll is a tight network or association of 25 different land masses that vary in size from not much bigger than this room to about 100 hectares. It's about 240 acres. And the rats were present on every single one of those little land masses when I was down there doing my research.
Right, because rats actually are pretty decent swimmers, actually.
Right, they're fantastic swimmers, and they're very prolific. As you said, we estimated the population of rats at Palmyra to be about 30,000 rats, so somewhere between...
There's only, a square mile of land or something there, right?
Yeah, so it comes out to about 240 rats per acre, which is, if you think of, that's not a lot. There's not a lot of land area for that many rats. So they were very dense. And what you mentioned earlier about rats being very adaptive and very general in terms of their foraging habits is so true. They eat everything from leaves and plant material to insects to seabird chicks and eggs, and even seabird adults if they can get them, to land crabs, to just anything that is edible to them they will eat.
Right. And they've been, I suspect, a target of a number of different of these attempts to remove invasive species because rats are so ubiquitous. They're carried everywhere people have gone, basically, since ancient times.
Yeah, they are on over 85% of the world's islands right now. And and so I think there have been over 700, I don't know the exact number, but over 700 attempts to eradicate rats from islands, and most of them have been successful.
Good. So, all right, well, that's actually a beautiful segue here. So you had to figure out how to get the rats off of these islands. Clearly, with all 25, you had to move on the whole patch at once, because if you left them on some, they'd soon be back on others. You had to figure out how to do this effectively, how to do it without hurting other species, because, of course, you don't want to, you could go over the whole thing with a flamethrower and get rid of them, but you'd knock everything else out too, right, which would not be good.
Right.
So what did you finally come up with?
Well, so directly following my graduate research, which was focused on what are the rats doing to the ecosystem, I joined Island Conservation, and at that time we focused on investigating exactly that. How do we effectively and safely take rats off of this island to protect the native species and the ecosystem as a whole? And so for rodent eradication, the governing principle is quite simple. It's that you have to remove the population faster than it can replace itself. And that's actually probably for all eradication projects, no matter what the species is that is the focus. And with Palmyra, as you said, because the landscape is so fragmented, we had to figure out how to do that on all 25 islands all at the same time. And rats are such prolific breeders that you only have about a 2-month window in between generation times.
Right.
2 to 3 month window. And so we had to remove all of the rats off the island within that 2 to 3 month window period. And with rodent eradications, the only effective strategy that has been identified or has been found to remove them or eradicate them from islands is through the use of a rodenticide. And that's for islands that are larger than 20 acres, 20 to 30 acres. Anything larger than that, the system is just too complex to remove them with just traps alone or hunting or something else.
Right.
And that's because rats are they're very intelligent, and they're also very neophobic. They're afraid of new things. So not all rats will go into a trap, but all rats will eat.
Right.
And so the way to get rid of rats off of a larger complex island is to deliver a rodenticide, which is a toxicant that's specifically formulated to target rodents.
Right.
You deliver that within a cereal grain bait. So it's an inert sort of bait matrix, and you have a tiny, tiny amount of rodenticide in each bait pellet or bait block, depending on how you're doing this. And you apply that to the entire land area at the same time, and you do it in such a way that all rats are given an opportunity to eat enough bait to die.
So part of it is actually the dispersal of the bait is actually a very critical aspect, to be sure you got a very even spread, so there are no little
Yes.
spaces where there isn't bait, because that would enable it.
Yeah.
And you were talking, when we spoke some weeks ago, you were talking about the issue of how fast the rodenticide actually works as being also a factor, right?
Yeah, that's actually very important. There are a lot of different rodenticides out there that have been used by pest management entities over several decades. And the ones that are most effective for eradication projects, where you are trying to your goal is to get rid of 100% of the population. If you leave one pregnant female rat on the island, then that entire effort could be all for naught.
Right.
You would,
Right, 'cause within 3 or 4 years, there'll be thousands of rats.
faster
eaten.
than that. Within a year, you'll be back up to near carrying capacity for an island the size of Palmyra, or an atoll the size of Palmyra. And so with Palmyra, we took 7 years to conduct. I think we had 5 or 6 distinct research projects that informed the partnership for this project on exactly how we needed to structure the eradication to provide a really high probability that we would remove every single rat.
Right, without hurting, for instance, the coconut crabs that were there, or any
Right.
of the other hermit crabs, and
Well, yeah, and I'm glad you brought up the crabs. And I should just take 1 second to step back and say that Palmyra is a really unique place. It's a national wildlife refuge that is managed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and also part of it's co-managed by the Nature Conservancy. So it's a really neat collaborative management process between those two, the Nature Conservancy and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And they have a really strong and dedicated conservation and management agenda for the island. And removing rats was definitely part of that agenda. And so their interest of bringing island conservation in was to how do we do this, and how do we do this so it doesn't impact the ecosystem. And land crabs are interesting because land crabs on islands on these tropical islands are the primary drivers in a natural setting. They're the primary drivers of the system. When rats come in, they displace the land crabs. But there were still at Palmyra. Palmyra has a really robust community of land crabs. There's well over 100 crabs per hectare there. Actually now there's 10 different species, and I'll get into why that's actually an important number in a minute. But when we were doing the eradication, there were 6 species that would also consume the bait that would be put out for rats.
right.
But the rodenticide that we use for this project, and that's typically used in all rodent eradication projects, is only toxic to vertebrates. And so it's not toxic to invertebrates like land crabs. So they will consume it, but it does not harm them.
Excellent, excellent. And a very critical aspect, of course,
Yeah.
yes. You've got to make the bait unpalatable to them, or
Yes.
make sure the poison doesn't hurt them, right?
Right.
So somebody had to study and find some chemical that will prove quite toxic to rats, but is not harmful particularly to the crabs, or
Right.
any invertebrates, basically.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And there's no other vertebrate species there to worry about, the people who presumably know about this and aren't going to go around eating the grain that you're scattering around.
Exactly. Well, there are, well, actually, no, there are other vertebrate species there that were of concern.
Birds, I guess.
Yeah, shorebirds
Right.
are one of them. And so the eradication project was timed during the summer. So it happened in June of 2011. And we specifically timed it for that month because that's when the migratory shorebirds that overwinter at Palmyra most of them were up at their breeding grounds in Alaska.
Okay.
And so we knew that they were at risk from the rodenticide that would be used to eradicate the rats, but if we did the project at that time, we would minimize the impact to those species.
Yeah. Okay, good. And so this must have been a very high-stress period. It was getting ready to do this, and then actually, bang, so one day you go out there and you start distributing.
Yeah, it's incredibly stressful because, as I said, it was a 7-year process to develop the methodology for this project.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a really tight collaboration between Island Conservation, the Nature Conservancy, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I have a PowerPoint slide that has all these statistics on it. We had like 90-something meetings. We had, I don't know how many thousands of pages of documents that we wrote and reports that we wrote to really, get this project really fine-tuned. We went through a very extensive environmental compliance process.
Sure.
And then all of that 7 years of prep goes down in about a 2-week period for the eradication.
Right.
So we used helicopters to aerially apply bait to every single island throughout the atoll. We did that twice, about 10 days apart. Each application, well, the 2 applications were 10 days apart. And
the 10 days apart being about the time you figured if for some reason there had been nursing pups who were finishing up nursing at the end of the first one, they could conceivably miss getting it. And there might have been a few of them left, thus a few rats, which you don't want.
Yeah, it was on the short end of the ideal window. You typically want to wait, when you think rats are breeding, you would want to wait more around 20 days, but we had some other constraints at Palmyra. We wanted to make sure that the bait was not going to be available for the shorebirds when they came back. So we pushed it on that end, but it ended up working out. So.
Excellent. And no one has seen a rat since then.
No one has seen a rat since. It has been 4 years since the eradication, and the results have just been incredibly positive for the atoll. Yeah.
And I loved your story too. So, of course, so some of our audience is going to want to know this, right? So suddenly you've got all these dead rats sitting around.
Yes. So Palmyra is, again, for many reasons, fortunate to have so many land crabs, but the land crabs think of them as the decomposers or the janitors of the ecosystem. And we actually did a study on this to look at how long would it take for the land crabs, and in this case primarily the hermit crabs at Palmyra, to consume a rat carcass. And it took anywhere between 15 to 30 hours with an average of about 24 hours for a pile of hermit crabs to reduce a rat carcass just down to teeth, which is gruesome, but also very important in that the rat carcasses, after the rats consume the rodenticide is still present in their tissue for a short time period. But with the crabs consuming the rats, then they reduce the access to the rodenticide by processing some of it and excreting some of it as excrement. And so it made the project a little bit safer.
Wow, excellent, super. That had to feel good then to have this basically work as planned, right?
Yeah.
You must have breathed a real sigh of relief at the end of that.
I did. Although I think I suffered. I joked with my wife about this a little bit, but I suffered postpartum depression, I think, after the project, because it was 7 years of my life all leading up to this one action, and then it was just over in a month's period, or two weeks of really intense activity, and then in a month everything was done, and I just didn't know what to do with myself afterwards, so I just kind of wandered for a while, but
Indeed.
Back on it now.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's got to be, it's a huge accomplishment, actually, and a truly amazing piece of work. So that's wonderful. We're going to look a little bit to the future then when we come back and talk a little more, look back up at sort of the bigger picture of where conservation is going, where extinction is going, and talk about a bunch more interesting things when we come back.
Great.
So I'm Ethan Allen, your host on Likeable Science. Alex Wegman from Island Conservation is with me today, and we're talking about conservation on islands. We'll be right back.
Okay, I'm Jay Fidel, that's Ray Starling. We co-host a show called Hawaii, the State of Clean Energy, every Wednesday, 4 to 5 p.m. It's really interesting. You know, Ray has a way of unzipping these guys. He asks them these questions and all this stuff tumbles out, and we find out stuff we would never know about without Ray's questions. Thank you, Ray.
You're welcome, Jay. I'm very pleased to be your Ed McMahon every Wednesday at 4 o'clock here on the internet. So you can join us and see what's happening in the energy world, and there is a lot going on. So join us every Wednesday at 4 o'clock.
Yeah, come around, be energized, right here on ThinkTech. Aloha.
Aloha, I'm Hunter Hevlin, host of Sustainable Hawaii here at ThinkTech Hawaii. You can tune in every week on Thursday at 2 p.m. to see interviews with sustainability professionals from around the state and even further abroad, learning about activities with water management, food security, waste management, and a whole host of other fascinating opportunities to get engaged with making a greener island. So if you're interested in making the transition from consuming individuals to communities of producers, check us out every Thursday.
And you're back here on Likeable Science. I'm your host, Ethan Allen, here on ThinkTech Hawaii. With me today, I have a program manager from Island Conservation, Alex Wegman. And Alex and I have been talking about island issues in general, island ecosystems, why they're vulnerable to extinction and invasion. We talked in our last segment about his astounding work at ridding Palmyra Atoll of all of its rats that had been there for decades, and a population numbering in minimally the tens of thousands of rats, if not hundreds of thousands. Mm-hmm. And but then we want to step back a little bit and look sort of at this bigger picture about extinction and the issues more broadly. I think we have a figure or two, a diagram or two maybe that'll help launch this. Mm-hmm. And
so islands are really important. They represent a small proportion of the total land area of the planet, so just 5%. Right. Yeah. However, they host or are refuges for 39% of the critically endangered species that are left on our planet. So these are species that are at the brink of extinction.
Sure. In part, some of them are on the brink of extinction because they live on only a few small islands. Right?
Exactly, yeah, and they're vulnerable for the reasons that we discussed earlier.
Right, yeah. A bad hurricane,
yes.
Anything like that.
Yeah.
So, yeah. And then this next image that's up here now.
Mm-hmm. So extinction is a natural process. Extinction has always occurred since life began for whatever billion years ago. Right. However, the rate of extinction that we have observed in the last 500 years has way outpaced what we think or what we have record of happening prior to that.
Right. Extinctions have generally been a rather gradual event taking place over long spans of geologic time, and we have managed, the classic case, I think, is the passenger pigeon in the U.S., which even in the second half of the 1800s existed in flocks, individual flocks of billions and multiple billions of birds. Yes. And yet, 50, 60 years later, the species was gone off the planet.
Extinct, right. Yeah, and the rate, I think the background rate of extinction used to be about one species every 100 years. Mm-hmm. And what we're experiencing now is one species per year. Yeah. So 100 species every 100 years.
Right, and sort of say what you want about human impact, a bunch of that 99 can probably be attributed to us.
Directly or indirectly.
Yeah, yes. Either we've taken away their habitat, we've given them some sort of toxin inadvertently, we have hunted them to extinction, we have, one thing or another, we've taken their food sources away,
Right.
Yeah, right. So this is really then gets into what people are talking about as sort of the sixth major extinction event on the planet, right? Because there have been various things when either massive lava flows and or cometary impacts have hit, and we see in the fossil record these dramatic drop-offs and die-offs of many life forms across the face of the planet. Right. And we believe we're sort of on the downward slope in one of these right now.
Yes, it does seem to be that is the case, for sure. And there are a lot of different factors that are contributing to this extinction event. Climate change is one that everybody talks about. It's very, a very popular topic. And there are definitely things we can do to slow down the rate of climate change and therefore hopefully slow down the rate of extinctions that are caused by that. And with that in mind, there are also things we can do like sort of minimizing the impact of invasive species on these critically endangered species that can actually stop or prevent the extinctions from happening right now for a certain, for a certain suite of native species out there on islands. And I emphasize the islands part because islands, because they're vulnerable because they're remote. However, they're also, from a biodiversity perspective, that is also an advantage to them, in that they're a smaller ecosystem, they represent a smaller ecosystem that is manageable.
Right, but they're also sort of protected in a sense by their
And
isolation.
they're protected by their isolation.
Right.
And so the changes that you can create by removing an invasive, positive changes you can create by removing an invasive species from an island ecosystem, as long as you can keep that invasive species off, those benefits will be sustained forever.
Yeah.
Whereas in a continental environment, it's too hard to do that.
Right, yeah,
Yeah,
you could not imagine getting rid of the rats off of the North American continent.
Exactly.
I mean, there's no way that is ever going to happen until something really bad happens to the planet.
We need some better tools for that, that's for sure.
No, I think the rats are probably going to outlast us.
Yeah.
So there's a whole bunch of different aspects to this work, then, it seems to me. I mean, there is sort of this logistical planning. One of the areas I gather is this, we talked of the use of the rodenticide earlier, having it very neatly targeted. And I gather this is a very hot area of research still, right? It's finding new, better, improved chemicals that will target a specific species very neatly, right?
Absolutely. So the conservation community that is involved in the removal of invasive species from islands is always looking for better ways to use the existing tools that we have. And by tools, I mean, anything that you would use to remove an invasive species from an island or a population of an invasive species. And in this particular case, talking about rodents with rodenticides, we're always looking for ways for more effective and safer tools.
Right.
So tools that provide a very high probability of success, and that is important because these projects are so complicated, they're expensive, they take a really long time, huge amount of resources to do this, and then also because we want to see the benefits from the project, so we want them to succeed, obviously, and then we're all conservationists that are engaged in this. We're all biologists. We're animal lovers, and we do not want to cause significant or undue harm to any component of the native ecosystem.
Right, and whereas the classic case when I grew up here was 1080,
yes,
which is this toxin that goes and goes and goes, and it's like the Energizer Bunny, right? It keeps going and going and going, and it kills off its intended victim. Things that eat it then die, things that eat those things then die, and so on. It persists, whereas hopefully now you've got better things that work effectively, but break down quickly or whatever.
Yeah, or just tools or ideas that are completely out of that box. Right. So there are ideas that are looking at pesticides that are species specific, that are only toxic to the target species.
Right. So in Guam, they're using acetaminophen-laced mice to get rid of the brown tree snakes, who have to be exquisitely sensitive apparently to acetaminophen.
Exactly.
And relatively, most other species can tolerate it to some extent or another, but brown tree snakes can't really tolerate much at all.
Right. Yeah. So that's a very focused tool for those. And then other tools are looking at there's genetic tools out there to try to be species specific, and then another way to look at it is how do we maybe not making the pesticide specific to just the target animal, but how do we deter non-target animals from consuming the bait in the first place?
Right. Make it unpalatable. Yeah. I'd imagine there must be people these days looking at the whole thing of trying to do genetic modification in disease organisms or pest organisms for a target species to make them
Right.
more effective on the target and less likely to spread to anything else.
Exactly,
Yeah.
right.
So it's huge, this is sort of a big business, really. And
It's a big field, yeah. and there are-
There's a huge need for it.
Yeah.
If we are indeed moving into a global extinction event, we
Yeah.
really need to amp up our conservation tools then big time, right?
Yeah, well, there's absolutely a conservation need for it, and there's also a human health need because a lot of introduced invasive species are disease vectors, and there is a food security need. A lot of introduced invasive species are, they're big-time crop pests, and they have a huge impact on local agriculture.
Oh, yeah.
And so a more effective, more environmentally friendly strategies to reduce the impact of invasive species on all of these different areas. We should constantly be looking for those new tools.
Yeah. So let me circle back to Palmyra for a moment or two. So what's sort of next for Palmyra? You got rid of the rats, great. Everybody's happy.
Yeah, we
rats, but
got rid of the rats, and we're already experiencing a lot of the ecosystem responses that we had hoped to see. Palmyra is an incredibly wet environment. It rains 200 plus inches there a year. So the plant response has been phenomenal. We have a lot of native tree species there that we're not able to recruit with rats present. So the rats would eat all the seeds and all the seedlings. Now that the rats are gone, we're seeing seedlings from those native tree species pop up here and there.
Excellent.
And so that's really exciting. And we have also seen 2 species of land crabs. So I said before that there were 6 species really active during the eradication, and since then, 2 that we knew were there have become way more prominent, way more present throughout the atoll. And then we've had 2 additional species show up at Palmyra.
Huh.
That they're not new to science, but they're new to the atoll. And these are species that the rats must have prevented from recolonizing the atoll by eating the young crabs as they emerge from the marine environment to the terrestrial environment. And now with the rats gone, these crabs are everywhere. And it's really fantastic.
And I gather there's people also, though, looking sort of to cycle back to one of our earlier points, are people looking to get rid of some of the trees that were introduced there, right?
Yeah, so that's a
Because those have actually, in a sense, become invasive to some extent.
Right. So we knew this going into it. We being the partnership, the Fish and Wildlife Service, the Nature Conservancy, and Island Conservation. Going into this project, we knew that getting rid of rats would free up the coconut palms that are down there from seedling and seed predation. And since the rats have been gone, the coconut palms have been recruiting like crazy and are threatening to replace the native trees and to take over the native forest. And so the Nature Conservancy and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service are developing a strategy right now to address that issue.
Yeah, it's sort of a never-ending thing.
Well, hopefully not never-ending, but it's a complicated process.
You open one can of worms only to discover more worms within it, right?
Yes, yes.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Well, this has been a really amazing conversation here. I feel like I've learned a huge amount about the work you do and the complications and issues around conservation islands, why it's so important, why, and some of the hows about what you have to consider about doing it, and that's great. And I certainly wish you continued success. Sounds like you're doing extremely valuable work here in Hawaii and elsewhere, and we will keep island conservation, keep good thoughts going for island conservation, that it thrives and survives like the species that it's saving, right?
Fantastic. Thank you, Ethan.
Excellent. Well, thanks for being here, Alex.
You're welcome.
Very much enjoyed having you. Aloha.
Aloha.
And we hope you'll join us next week on another episode of Likeable Science.